Okay.
Hi, hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. Welcome to the Geoscience and Geoenergy webinar of 22nd of April 2021. And happy the Earth Day as well. So it's a special day that we are also having a webinar as well. And we rightly deserve that, Sebastian, to have a webinar on the Earth Day. So we have a Geoscience channel, so that's precisely about it. Today, Sebastian and myself are delighted, pleased, and honored to welcome our dear colleague Jen Roberts from the University of Strathclyde here with us today. Jen is a Chancellor's Fellow in Energy, which is a research-facing lectureship position at the University of Strathclyde in Britain. Her research is interdisciplinary and applied and addresses the social and environmental risk of geological energy resources, including CO2 storage, hydrogen and compressed air energy storage, geothermal, and water. These risks vary from the very specific or technical facing to broad and societal facing, and the range of risks and impacts and decision-making processes in between. Ultimately, her work aims to inform how the necessary transition to a net zero carbon future can be implemented in a way that is acceptable to society and to the environment. And everybody here knows that this is an extremely important and impactful research topic. In addition to growing and developing her field through research, she's supervising and training students involved in consultancy and event organizations. Jen is the director also of a research program, MRES programs, delivered in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering at the University of Strathclyde. And also she teaches on several undergraduate and master courses as well. She's quite active in so many aspects of this complex academic life that we all know about: research, teaching, administration, training, and all interesting aspects. She's also a co-founder of Strathclyde's new Global Environmental Monitoring and Policy, GEMAP, Center for Doctoral Training. So it's very interesting to be involved in doctoral training programs. Jen, is just, so you have so diverse activities that is just quite interesting and very much good to have the audience also learn about all these activities that they can be involved in. It's a pleasure and honor to host you, Jen. Thank you for graciously accepting our invitation today, this very special day, and for the very special topic that you have. We are delighted and pleased to have you here give a lecture. To the audience, please note, Jen's lecture would take for about half an hour, followed by discussion and questions. And like always, please do post your questions in the chat box whenever you feel appropriate, and do not wait till the end of the lecture. Whenever you feel that it's the time to post your questions, please do type in. It might also trigger other questions by the other audience as well. And after the lecture time, Sebastian will share the discussion like always, especially for this interesting topic for today's special also event. We are looking forward to a very diverse and also engaging discussion session with Jen today with us as well. Once more, thanks a lot, Jen, for graciously accepting our invitation. Our pleasure to have you here with us. We are all looking forward to hearing your lecture.
Wow, thank you very much, and what an introduction. It's an absolute pleasure to be here talking to you all. And I feel like you've had such a thorough introduction to the range of things that I do. But yeah, as Haley said, like the bulk of my research addresses the risks around geoenergy resources, from technical risks around ensuring that the systems in the subsurface are fit for purpose, to ensuring that we can have the tools and capabilities to detect and quantify possible leakage pathways, through to communicating geological and geosocial risks. But I'm also really interested in geoenergy or geo-resources from a whole systems risk perspective, or putting it differently, from a whole systems sustainability perspective. from ensuring that geoenergy technologies are as low carbon as possible, and in particular, approaches to minimising negative environmental and social impacts, and maximising the range of co-benefits that these technologies can bring. So you'll be hearing aspects of this interest in the talk today. So today I'm going to be presenting a broader research perspective on the many and varied roles of geoscience and geoenergy, sustainable development and the net zero energy transition. The date is 22nd of April, which is Earth Day 2021. For those unfamiliar with Earth Day, it's a global movement to drive positive action for our planet. And this year, the focus is restoring our Earth, which specifically identifies climate technologies and applications as key topics. And so speaking to this geoenergy audience on Earth Day, it really felt appropriate to present a broad research perspective on geoenergy and geoscience for the future. And I was really excited to pull this together for you. It's actually a new talk for me. I've not given it before, and this opportunity really prompted me to pull together and synthesize some of my reflections in this space, drawing on or kind of mapping research topics, experiences, and discussions I've had as an interdisciplinary researcher working in geoenergy resource and risk research and policy for a sustainable future. I've also not spoken to such a global audience before on such a broad topic too, so it's a very exciting opportunity for me, so thank you very much for having me. Now, I had hoped to squeeze in some illustrative insights about some of my more technical research on long-term geological storage, but full disclosure from the outset, when putting together the talk, that just didn't fit so well. And so though I do draw on CCS quite a lot for examples, I don't talk too much about my own research, but more like these perspectives and experience in the research landscape. But hey, I can always come back if you'll have me again to give another more technical talk in the future. So just then I mentioned mapping. And yes, I've organised this talk into a series of mapping exercises, mapping out geoscience for the future. This isn't just because I'm desperately missing physical fieldwork. Like many of you, I'm sure, our work's been much constrained due to the ongoing pandemic restrictions. And if you're missing fieldwork, then perhaps I can refresh you slightly with all this talk of mapping. But I feel using the word mapping is appropriate here for several reasons, actually. First, through mapping, we understand our landscape. And getting a vision for our landscape for the geoscience of the future is one of my objectives for this talk. Second, for the geoscientists with us here today, it is through geological mapping that we understand what is more certain, so such as the geological contacts that we can see and observe in outcrop, and also what we can constrain as less certain, such as the geological relationships that we have to infer. And that's another objective today, to give some insights into what we know and what we don't know about this landscape that we're in for the future. And through mapping, we can also work out what further mapping we need to do next. And I hope to put a spotlight on some opportunities and challenges and gaps that we need to tackle going forward, and well, within the geosciences and within the geoscience sector, more specifically. And finally, it is through geological mapping that we really synthesize surface and subsurface systems. Mapping is a key concept, a key skill for geoscientists, because mapping synthesizes many processes and encourages us to think in space and time and all the interrelationships in the landscape. So a final objective for this talk is to really highlight the interconnectedness of geoscience and geoscientists amongst other disciplines and sectors. Net zero isn't a geoscience problem. It's everyone's problem, after all. And so it follows that thinking of geoenergy and the energy transition as a geoscience problem is just flawed. So to start us off, let's map the uses of the subsurface and how this is changing, because changing it is. The range of geoenergy technologies that you all work in are, I hope, represented here in this graph, with subsurface net zero technologies highlighted in bold, so low carbon technologies. The categories and the depths are perhaps debatable, we could discuss this, but the message is, the main takeaway is that we have many uses for the subsurface going forward into the future. And we will be managing the subsurface differently, depending on the application and, of course, the site. So for applications like geological CO2 disposal, the intention is to lock away the CO2 in rock formations, and activities will be predominantly injection, with perhaps some brine extraction for pressure management. For something like hydrogen storage, the intention is that the hydrogen will be temporarily stored to be extracted again when needed repeatedly. and so hydrogen storage activities will be cyclic. Now, that's just two examples of these different uses of the subsurface, and these different uses present some really interesting challenges to map out, and I'll come back to the slide in a minute. But first, let's just look to the expected scale-up for net zero subsurface technologies, mapping the magnitude of scale-up, because it's quite remarkable, and it never fails to ground me regarding the scale of the challenge or the opportunities, I suppose, depending on which way you want to view it. And it always surprises me, even when I work in this topic day to day. So let's look at carbon dioxide removal technologies like carbon capture and storage, CCS. Here is a graph from the emissions gap report published in 2017. And from the graph, looking at the blue stuff below the x-axis, it's clear that carbon dioxide removal through technologies such as CCS plays a critical role. And let's remember, carbon dioxide removal, CDR, is not considered optional, it's considered necessary. All pathways to net zero modelled by the IPCC require carbon dioxide removal to meet the 1.5 degree targets. But just how much of a role will geoenergy technologies like CCS play? Or how much CO2 storage are we talking about? I guess, what is that landscape for CCS? Now, this figure shows the trajectories for meeting the IPCC 1.5 degree ambition. Don't look too closely at it, there's no need to. In a nutshell, all I'm trying to communicate here is that depending on the scenario adopted, we need somewhere between 5 and 28 gigatons per year of CO2 storage by 2050, as depicted by the blue vertical arrow on the graph. That's the gap. So to put this number in context, we are currently extracting approximately 4.5 gigatons of oil annually. So the amount of CO2 we will be injecting will be larger than what the current oil industry extracts. These are powerful numbers, especially when you consider what the progress is just now. The numbers might have changed a little since this analysis by Stuart Hazeldine and co-authors, but not hugely. And essentially, today we're injecting 0.04 gigatons per year. That line, I can't even put it on the graph. It's such a small amount, you wouldn't be able to see it. And essentially, we're 2 orders of magnitude out for the minimum quantities of CO2 that we will be storing. So this is the scale of the challenge. This is the landscape for CCS. And that's only for CO2 storage. I can't remember how many different technologies I put on this image, but basically it's one of many other net zero technologies in bold that will be scaling up and scaling out to meet our net zero targets. And in mapping the subsurface uses, we can start to think of competing and complementary uses of the subsurface into the future too, and how these uses might interact, and differences in what constitutes favourable conditions for each of these different uses or technologies. And this is something I'm really interested in. For example, might the formations that I've used for CO2 storage actually be better placed as a hydrogen store? Or might the pressure perturbations expected from Sebastian's CO2 site interfere with Hades' CO2 storage site over here? Or perhaps Sebastian's CO2 storage might benefit operations at my hydrogen store. So how do we de-risk these possibly competing subsurface systems or make the most of their interactions? Is there a way to manage this to support development, or to support performance, or to support, say, reducing carbon footprint, or even the geoenergy job distribution associated with these technologies? So we're talking geoscience and also non-geoscience topics in terms of jobs and so on, and I'll keep coming back to this. But yeah, 3D and 4D planning and decision-making around geological assets is a really, really interesting topic and requires basin system thinking and adapting our knowledge of managing subsurface systems for oil and gas production to these cyclic storage or long-term disposal approaches. So let's talk about mapping our knowledge and our skills for the future next. Because I touched on something just there about adapting knowledge of managing subsurface systems for oil and gas production. And I want to expand on that point in the next few slides. We've been developing incredible geological skills, abilities, technologies, databases, and so on for a very long time. Between us, we've got a lot of knowledge of the subsurface. We've got software, we've got capability, and so on. We're also really quite knowledgeable about the limitations of our knowledge too. Something that I'm really interested in and working is about managing uncertainty. And managing uncertainty is part of what geoenergy, geoscience is about. But we've been adapting our skills and capabilities for decades, and I'm going to explore this just here. So I'm using an example from the structural geology community, and I'm sure there are several listening just now who get as excited by geological faults as me. And here we're looking at the Tectonic Studies Group, TSG, a specialist group of the Geological Society of London, and for their 50-year celebration that took place this January, myself and a wonderful team, including David McNamara, Chris Yeomans and Chris McMahon, looked back through the conference proceedings and abstracts that were available to us to see what the TSG community had been studying for 50 years. Now, TSG has a largely UK and some European memberships, but the story that comes out of this is relevant to other regions and subsets of geoscience too. And so even if faults bore you, this is relevant, I promise. I'll show you in a minute. So this is what we found. You don't need to go into the very fine detail here. I'll talk you through it. But this is TSG and what TSG has been talking about and sharing knowledge about over the decades. And we see that there have been really clear shifts and changes in the focus and application. In the very early years of TSGs, the 70s and 80s, the focus was on geological processes or observations rather than applications per se. And any applications were mostly around hydrocarbon systems. And in fact, we see a shift towards more applied research only in recent decades, including what we'd identify clearly as net zero aligned applications like CO2 storage, which first crept in the early 2000s, and hydrogen mentioned for the first time in 2020. Geothermal also popped up quite late, and the first explicit mention of policy in a talk was one that I gave in 2015. And so these applications came in a wee bit later, and I think there's been a very rapid pivot for the community into really informing our space and our role in terms of policy. But we did, so just to explain this process a bit, we did have an imperfect data set to work from, but that doesn't really matter so much here, because here we're just looking at the transition. And the point is, there's been a transition in topics or focus, science, tools, data, you name it. But at the end of the day, the TSG community has been studying some awesome rocks, some amazing systems from around the world and beyond, using a range of approaches. And the research within the TSG community has been built and built and built on each other, progressing knowledge, and ultimately much of the outcomes are actually translational. You know, it can be applied to multiple different outcomes and technologies. So to sort of demonstrate this, what we learned about fault seal for hydrocarbons is utterly important for fault seal for CO2 storage. That doesn't mean to say it's exactly the same. Obviously, there's a different fluids, they behave differently. But what we're doing is we're taking that knowledge and we are pivoting and adapting and growing knowledge progressively as these new technologies and applications come along. So I guess we've been transitioning our knowledge for decades as geoscientists. And another slightly busy slide, I don't want to panic you too much here, but I'll talk you through the main points. But as part of the 50 years of the TSG celebrations, we also mapped out the ways that tectonics and structural geology fits to net zero. And you can see key themes here in this diagram. And I don't claim that this diagram is comprehensive, but we've identified topic areas in green, applications in blue, and then various aspects of tectonics and structural geology like skills and approaches in yellow all around. And many of these structural geology skills map into resources, whether it's energy, water provision in a changing world, minerals and mining for net zero technologies, but with particular focus, I'd say, on geoenergy resources. And of course, key to all of this, and so leading on to the right of the image, is communication and knowledge translation, whether that's to support interdisciplinary working or to inform policy or to inspire geoscience interest more broadly, or just to communicate within our own specialist groups. So this was a mapping exercise for structural geology. We could do the same for other fronts of the geoscience ecosystem. You could do the same for your own particular expertise or application, and I bet your skills and knowledge is translational. And so the point here is that not only were these skills and resources key to the past, they are key to the present and to the future too. I'm kind of tweaking Charles Lyell's quote there a little bit, but the argument holds. These geoscience skills, techniques, data, and so on that were developed largely, but not wholly, for the oil and gas sector are totally relevant for net zero aligned energy transition applications. Geoscience is a really adaptable field. We can apply the same principles of observation and practice to different applications. And this might ring very true for those of you in the audience working on, say, petroleum systems and also maybe CCS. And certainly, wherever you're listening in from, there will have been a transitioning of geoscience interests and applications through time. And I find this really useful and calming to bear in mind when feeling a bit kind of overwhelmed by the scale of the transition, and that we've been doing this for decades, and we've got a lot of tools in our toolbox now. But of course, there are fundamental and interesting gaps in knowledge that new technologies present, which is keeping our research community very, very busy. So I don't mean to give the impression that we have things sorted. We definitely don't. But that's a mapping exercise in skills, data, and knowledge. What else can I map with you? Well, I can't give a talk about geoenergy and geoscience for the future without talking about the Sustainable Development Goals, or the SDGs. The goals that are set by the United Nations provide a blueprint for the future with clear objectives for 2030. And they are only 9 years away. We're in 2021. So the SDG agenda is 9 years away, and SDGs are directing policy, funding, education, you name it. But what I want to explore with you today is actually something a little bit more grisly, I suppose. It's a tendency within and beyond the geosciences to speak only about how our activities will progress the SDGs, rather than to also consider how our activities might inhibit progress. I find there's a tendency not to fully engage with the interconnectedness of the SDGs as well, and so to simply focus on the headline rather than the targets, the indicators. And so I'm going to talk a bit more here about putting a critical eye on the geosciences, and which, by doing so, should ultimately benefit the geoenergy sector. Now, I hope this poster by the Geological Society of London is familiar to you. It's a really great resource. And I appreciate that lots of the text will be very small. It's meant to be a large poster. But I've put the link there on the slides if you want to go and spend some time with it yourself. But it's a really great showcase of the range of geoscience applications for society and the social purpose of our field as well. And when you really look at it, it makes you think. For example, it shows how much geoscience is about the surface, not just the subsurface. And the activities that relate to the subsurface, so many of those activities are related to geoenergy. But looking at it also makes you realise how much it necessarily simplifies. It's a poster, it can't capture everything. So if we take engineering geology, which I've outlined in bright pink there, well, that's important for tunnels and therefore sustainable transport and so on, as depicted in this image here. But it's also important for hydropower over here, dam stability and other applications in mining and mineral resources. It can help to mitigate geohazards and inform, say, wind turbine stability for wind power onshore and offshore, and stabilise cliffs for erosion management. And so that's just an example of, just trying to really tease apart some of those applications. And I invite you to spend some time with this poster and consider how you could take your own knowledge and apply it to these various applications. And when you do that, it just shows, again, how adaptable geoscience and geoenergy knowledge and skills are, and how integrated geoscience is with society and with sustainable development more broadly. And I do particularly enjoy how geoscience research here in the centre is tackling literally everything. We're doing it all as researchers. But yeah, I guess, I'd encourage you to also think about what's missing, or to think about how your geoscience activity might hinder progress. And I'll come back to this poster in a few moments. I just want to give you a case study. So a recent IEA GHG report into carbon capture and storage provides this really nice geoenergy example to look at. The study looked at carbon capture and storage technologies against the SDGs and considered how CCS could support or hinder progress. Now, the objective of the assessment was actually to understand and communicate the relevance of CCS in contributing to the SDGs. But I think the work is particularly valuable in that it maps, with different levels of confidence, how CCS and its distributions or formulations could hinder sustainable development, rather than only considering the positive angle. And in taking that stance, it identifies some really important and interesting knowledge gaps. So in the study, IEA GHG identified which of the 17 SDGs that have a direct interaction for both power and industrial sectors. So I've organised these into how they've identified them. They considered only the goals with which CCS was perceived to have a direct interaction, so the ones on the left-hand side of the screen. They then assessed the evidence about whether CCS supported or hindered progress towards each target associated with each SDG. And the report found that CCS supports progress towards some goals very clearly and with confidence, and these are highlighted by black outlines in this image here. However, the evidence was mixed for other goals like 3, 6, and 15, which is health and well-being, water and sanitation, and life on land. And in particular, the report calls for further work, further life cycle assessments of CCS technologies in terms of greenhouse gas emissions and also other impacts such as water, more studies on the macroeconomic impact of CCS in different regions, and research on the employment aspects of CCS as well compared to other low emission technologies. And it also called for research, further understanding on the role of CCS technologies for carbon dioxide removal. And as we saw just before, there's a huge gap for carbon dioxide removal activity. And so actually the report shows a need to understand some things better so that all CDR activity through CCS that we showed needs to happen at scale. We need that further understanding to make sure that activity supports sustainable development more broadly. And I think that's a really interesting finding. But talking about employment aspects of CCS, 2 of the outcomes of that report were around job prospects and markets. And I think it's really interesting to pick this up because job prospects are often associated to SDG 8, which is about work and economic growth, which they did consider in their analysis. But when talking about job prospects, you also need to consider inequalities. And the IEA GHG analysis explicitly chose not to examine SDG 5, which is gender equality, and SDG 10, reduce inequalities, that were both scoped out of the study. I've picked those up in black on the right-hand side. And if we go back to this figure, the only parts of the geoscience ecosystem that notes SDG 5 and SDG 10 is this activity here right in the middle, geoscience communication and our research institutions. So I appreciate the text is really small, but yeah, this is the geoscience communication, and I'm not sure if you can see my mouse, but yeah, here is our geoscience research institutions. And yet, there are huge inequalities in the energy, and let's face it, the geoenergy sector. The International Energy Agency reports that the energy industry is one of the least diverse economic sectors in terms of gender globally. And in Scotland, reports published this year from the Scottish Government's Climate Emergency Skills Action Plan and the Just Transition Commission have identified labour market inequalities across age, gender, ethnicity and geography in the energy sector. And they conclude that these inequalities limit accessibility and innovation in the sector and highlight that research is needed to ensure a diverse workforce, that opportunities exist for a changing energy workforce, and that low carbon opportunities are accessible and fair. That's a big deal. For a just transition, that is a transition to low carbon energy, which, to use the language of the UN SDGs, leaves no one behind. We need to do this differently. Putting it bluntly, at the moment, people are left behind at the detriment to the geoenergy sector and at the detriment of our net zero ambitions. And I think it's important to tackle this as part of the net zero transition. This is a geoenergy problem. It's a problem for our sector. Or, again, turn it on its head. It's an opportunity for our sector to resolve going forward. So I thought this was great. This was published just yesterday. It was launched yesterday. It's hot from the press. I was looking to see where it was explicitly looked at the role of geoscience and SDG 5 and 10. And in this book, they examine geoscience in each of the 17 SDGs. Each chapter examines geoscience and the SDG at hand, the relationships to the SDG and opportunities for progress and challenges. And importantly, each chapter presents a very clear recommendation to the geoscience community about how to to progress on those goals going forward. Now, I've not, of course, read the entire book overnight, but piqued by writing this talk and realising how often the interlinkage of geoscience and equality is overlooked, I had a look at the chapters on Goal 5 and 10, and I find it very refreshing. Look at this. There are really clear recommendations for geoscience and the geoenergy community to support SDG 10, reduce inequalities. And those recommendations are around supporting and valuing knowledge exchange, creating safe and inclusive environments to study and work, paying attention to intersectional inequalities in our research, and improved access to education events and research outcomes, which actually, I guess, this webinar series is directly tackling to some extent. And for SDG 5, which was gender equality, I appreciate the text in this infographic is quite small, but the key messages include the need to increase awareness of gender inequality in the geosciences, to strengthen local to global geoscience networks, and support flexible working environments and increase the visibility of women and minority groups in geoscience. They also recommend to widen access to training and education and to encourage women into leadership positions and remove barriers that may prevent women and minority groups from going forward in those roles. And so my point is that these are all things that the geoenergy sector can do, or are doing actually. There are a number of initiatives, forums, networks, and large research projects around enhancing diversity in STEM, enhancing diversity in geoscience, diversity in geoenergy, diversity in CCS even. And I've, on this slide, just to the right-hand side, I've included only a few of these groups, like Black in Geoscience, Women in Geothermal, which is WING, and Pride in Energy. And just to highlight some of the progress that the Tectonic Studies group of GeoSoc London have been doing as well, singing their praises today, I am. But they have a code of conduct for conferences, and they published this report yesterday, which is the left-hand side of the screen. They published that report as part of efforts to support equality, diversity and inclusion, which actually the move to online conferencing is supporting, I suppose, again, as evidenced through this geoenergy webinar series. And back to SDG 10, there's an open access movement. If you remember, one of the recommendations for SDG 10 was around accessibility of outcomes from research. And so with stuff like, preprint servers like Earth Archive and new open access journals like ES3, they represent another move towards increased access to research outcomes and data. And they also represent, a move to thinking about Earth science, Earth systems and society remit. So capturing that societal aspect of geoscience. So geoenergy is relevant across all SDGs, and we need to be thinking critically about our role and our responsibilities for driving or hindering change within the sector as well. So these mapping exercises have, I hope, illustrated the need for geoenergy, geoscience for the future, and some of the challenges that we need to address and consider as a sector and as a community. And I think there are probably two outstanding things I'd like to bring home before I close. The first is that some geoscientists feel that the geoenergy sector is threatened by the future and the energy transition. Now, those of you who tune in regularly to this webinar series may not feel that way, because you've had a deep dive into both the progress and the gaps in research and industry. But if you're new to the series and you felt perhaps that there was no future for geoscience at the start of the webinar, then hopefully our quick foray today into the scale of the transition and some of the systems challenges will have given you a glimpse into the geoenergy sector for the future. And I appreciate that I've really barely touched on any of the applications like geothermal approaches and so on. But despite that, I think there is a gap in current understanding of jobs and opportunities in different regions and different countries and for different technologies, and as we transition the global energy sector. And there really is a need to get a handle of where we fit, where there's a skills gap or a skills surplus, and how to pivot those skills so that the range of net zero applications have the skilled workforce it needs and to support a just transition. And I suppose this is also relevant for higher education institutions like that we're part of, around making sure that we're outputting skilled geoscientists ready to deliver the kind of low carbon future. And there's plenty of fantastic MSc courses going on, Sebastian and Heidi. But I suppose I would want to kind of highlight also one of the problems in the UK, at least in the downturn in uptake of geosciences. Numbers are decreasing, and it's not quite clear whether at the moment there will be a skills gap and what needs to be done about it. So the second point that I wanted to close with relates to mapping geoenergy integrations into sustainable development and into society more broadly, including in terms of jobs and so on, but also, as I say, more broadly. As I said right at the very start of this talk, net zero geoenergy technologies are not simply a geoscience problem, and thinking of geoenergy and the energy transition as a geoscience problem is flawed. So recognising that our science isn't removed from policy and society is really important, and such socio-scientific or socio-geological, I suppose, challenges are particularly prevalent for topics that are unfamiliar, that are uncertain, that are emerging, they're new, and where change is needed fast. And topics, just like the use of our subsurface and these new geoenergy resources for the future. So there's quite a challenge on our hands there. And the many applications that geoscience underpins for net zero are, they're really deeply embedded in issues of social and environmental justice. And we can't and we shouldn't disentangle our work from that. So even if, all you want to do all day is interpret seismic data, that's fine, we all love data, but we need to develop our perspective of where we sit in the system and our responsibilities as a result, not just for the stuff that we do, but also the workplace and the work environment that we're part of. And in fact, I think that tackling and resolving some of those challenges for geoenergy really is what we need geoscience to help with for the future. So there we go. I've mapped out net zero transition energy technologies, knowledge, skills and data transitions, and the SDG framework for geoenergy, and the need for, I guess, an integrated and interdisciplinary perspective for these geoenergy approaches. Now, I could have mapped out many more aspects. I had other mapping activities in my mind as I was preparing this, but I think I'd like to stop here. I'd like to acknowledge my colleagues, my collaborators, and I suppose just encourage you, without wanting to sound too preachy, even though it is Earth Day and I feel like I'm allowed to because of that, I'd encourage you to reflect on your sector, your organisation, your skills and your networks in the context of an integrated and sustainable and low carbon future in which geoenergy plays its part. So those are my kind of discussion points, my food for thought, and I look forward to your thoughts and your questions.
Thank you very much, Jen, for this very, very interesting and engaging lecture. I have quite a few points myself, but I'd rather first give the floor to the audience first, but it was really interesting and a lot of things we could discuss right now. And I just hand it over to Sebastian before I start asking mine without standing in line.
Yes, likewise, Jen, thank you for a fantastic talk and really great topic to discuss on Earth Day. And I was thinking how lovely it would be to have a proper panel discussion today. And maybe we need to do this for Earth Day 2022, Hardy.
Absolutely. And I see also Philip is here with us as well.
Panel discussion, because there's so many things that would be great to talk through. So questions are coming in already, and I'm picking up the first one from Phil Ringrose, one of the first speakers we had in our webinar series. We have a great talk on CCS, and Phil raises a really important point. It says it's easy for geoscientists to persuade their own community that we are valuable for the future of geoenergy. But how do you convince the public and society? Should we rebrand ourselves as Earth scientists?
Yeah. Oh, Phil, what a question. This is something that I think it's really pertinent right now. We're discussing it, we've discussed it, we discuss it amongst our networks. So basically, there's a kind of transition from geoscientists are being depicted as the villain, the ones pumping out, contaminants and air pollution and so on. There's transition towards understanding the geoscience of the future and our role in delivering a clean and sustainable future for all. And I think I don't have the answer to this. This is a panel, I'd love Phil if you could sort of hop on and have a chat about this as well. But this is coming, it comes out of almost every single discussion and conference and event that we have in Geoscience for the Future. And I guess there's rebranding, and there's also just awareness raising. There's all the work that we could do around kind of, I was going to say schools, like targeting, younger populations, particularly thinking about this kind of potential skills gap. But actually, I think it's not just working with the public. Those of you who've heard me speak before know that I can get a bit frustrated sometimes with kind of almost blaming the public for not understanding that we are important. For you picked it up in your question there. We're good at telling ourselves that we're important, but we need to be better at working with others to understand our role. And it's probably not in a case of providing information and workshops and so on. It's a bottom up, capturing hearts and minds. And talk from Sir Andrew Mackenzie last week was all around storytelling and narratives for geoscience and kind of reconnecting, encouraging the wider stakeholders, including the public, about how to connect with geoscience. And he actually represents, I think he described geoscientists as custodians to the core, custodians of our Earth to the core, which is a very debatable description actually, but I think it's very poetic. And maybe that's, part of this broadening of understanding of geoscience and the range of ways that we integrate with society.
Thank you. The questions coming in fast and furious, and we have a question. God, I can't click as quickly as they're coming in. We have a question from one of our upcoming speakers, Katriona Edelman from Edinburgh University. Katriona, we're looking forward to your talk in a few weeks' time. She says, thank you, Jen. Interesting, thought-provoking talk. How important do you think is it that the whole geoscience community have an integrated and cohesive voice, or are dissenting voices important? You touched a little bit upon the storytelling and how we present ourselves.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And actually, I think dissenting voices are really important, to challenge each other and to challenge preconceptions, and to not to necessarily critique, but to say, well, we can build on that. But there's definitely a way in which we can operate and we can do things. And I think, tearing down, whether it's studies of the past or current studies or, perspectives that you disagree with, I see some very, very unprofessional behaviour in the geoscience community, and that's not a community that we want to be part of. So I think there's a really interesting point here around dissenting voices, and I think we're all united in thinking that, or seeing a role for geoscience into the future, but quite what that role might be, there's no single answer. So there will be dissenting voices, and I think where the challenges happen when people present information as facts, and we see this can tear policymakers apart. Present information as facts, and actually they're based on assumptions and models, and so we have to be really careful about how we conduct ourselves professionally in a supportive way, and also making sure to say where we disagree or where we want to build on knowledge. And I think there's some really interesting reflections that you can take on, say, like the fracking sector. When you start to, fracking or other technologies can be extremely emotive. And really interestingly, the researchers that work in those fields can also become very emotive. And I think it's a lot of social science that's done on experts and expertise and how they own their field. And I think it's just something to be very, very cautious of and aware of when we're presenting, particularly geoscience for the future, because the geoscience for the future has to be inclusive, and you can disagree in a very inclusive way.
Thank you. That's a really good answer. I think Phil just followed up and said, thanks, Jen, climate scientists are like gods, while earth scientists are like devils. And so following up on this with perhaps, with a comment from Florian, and says, very nice talk, Jen, thank you. What would you tell someone who says that essentially geoscientists are just desperately looking for new jobs in the energy transition? So, we've pumped out the oil, we've mined the ores, and now we're just trying to keep ourselves alive by reinventing ourselves. So how do we answer such a perhaps somewhat slightly cynical question?
Yeah, it's really, these are all excellent questions. And I suppose, we're not, well, I guess I am standing here saying that we've got an important role into the future, but I'm not basing that on my opinion. I'm basing that on, the Committee on Climate Change's 6th Carbon Budget Report that is telling me that CCS is critical. And I'm basing it, on these global projections from the IPCC that is telling me that CDR is a critical pathway, and there's multiple different approaches for carbon dioxide removal, of which CCS is one part. But that's what I see as the case for us as geoscientists. It's not as trying to make a home for ourselves in the future, although there's clearly a need to make sure that how our skills and knowledge is transitioned is done in a fair and inclusive way. So I guess I would say, if someone was challenging me like that, I would say, well, these reports are not written by geoscientists. And actually, this is really difficult. This is difficult technology to do. We can do it, but it requires policy interventions and new business models and all these things. It's not like an easy process. And geoscience is only a small part of that cog. We are all at the whim of policy, essentially, with CCS. And so I don't think we play a critical enough role to be saying that we are the ones, out of our interests and ambitions, that we are changing the landscape. But related to that, if I may, I'd like to pick up on something, we've been asked, we've got new graduates who are desperate to work in jobs in the energy transition, maybe to work on CCS projects or geothermal projects. And it's very frustrating because there's just not enough, for jobs to be available, you have to have projects. And so it becomes a bit of a chicken and egg thing with the skills, because you want to make, it's through the projects that you get the skills as well. So I think the need to kind of keep investing in projects is really critical to make sure that our graduates are going into these geoenergy jobs. However, as I said before, our knowledge is translational. So there's, if those projects are not available right now, working in the oil and gas sector, but will you be able to transition to those low carbon approaches as part of that job? Or I can't really say, but I do think it's kind of interesting thinking about the frustrations of those wanting to work in low carbon technologies. And I guess when I graduated from my undergraduate, I think, when was that? 2005. I was looking to work in CCS. I'm still doing research in it, so there's just that, at that time there was not the jobs, and I guess that's one of my points, is around those who are desperate to work in the sector. We need to get those jobs available.
Christina has a slightly different spin to the question that Florian has asked, in a more positive ways. Fridays for Future showed that there's a high interest in the topic of climate change and net zero from the young generation. How can we source this to get more geoscience students and researchers excited in our field?
Yeah, I see. So there's so much potential to use mechanisms like the Fridays for the Future, and work like in schools. Geosciences London have got some really, really good resources and do some really great stuff. And I suppose it's rather than going in with a message, there's a beautiful poster, for example, of all the components that make up your smartphone and how they relate back to our planet, our resources. It's another Geosciences London poster. I didn't mean for this to be such a pro Geosciences. I'm not actually part of, I'm a fellow, but I'm not sure. I've not got an agenda here. But posters like that, it's about, that's not talking about geoscience. We're talking about our smartphones, and then we talk about geoscience under that. And I think that's part of possibly one of the approaches that we can take when I was saying about meeting, whether it's meeting policymakers or meeting communities where they're at. You have to frame things in the stuff that interests them, and going to them with, talking about geology might not be the way forward. Maybe you've got a different leading question. And I guess with talking to policymakers, you're talking about the stuff that's high on their agenda, like decarbonising industry or infrastructure for the future. And you can then start positioning geoscience within those topics of interest for them. And I suppose the same thing kind of goes for the Fridays for the Future. And part of the reason why it's so successful is because there's so many inspiring approaches. But I do feel like there's a wealth of really great initiatives. And I suppose that the sad thing is that a lot of them are just not institutionalized. So they are kind of organizations or volunteer groups or initiatives. They're not, there's a large body of people who are very disappointed with the kind of drop in geoscience in the curricula in the UK, and the repercussions of that for young inspired earth science coming into the field. But without wanting to answer the question for too long, another thing is that geoscientists can go into all sorts of applications, not just geoenergy or geoscience. And the same is true. I'm now working in a civil and environmental engineering department. There's loads of geoscientists within that engineering department, but it's kind of there, and many mathematicians and physicists and engineers working in geoscience. So there are other routes into geoscience as well. So it's not just, you don't have to have that that geoscience pathway. Although I do find that geological mapping just changes people's perspectives. So maybe we just need engineers that have a bit of mapping as part of their training, you know.
It's certainly something that I realize how the geoscience world is shifting. It becomes much more quantitative, and yes, mapping and the 3D space is important, but mapping out your favorite thin bed and your favorite outcrop for the next 10 years. And this is how I was trained as an alpine geologist some time ago. You spend lots and lots of time mapping, but without sort of quite understanding why you do the mapping other than to building the 3D picture. You answered you had a long answer to Christine's question. I think you answered Marty's question, was asked about how we can increase public awareness about the importance of technologies in CCS and blue hydrogen along the way. And I want to bring up a question from one of your former colleagues at Edinburgh University and also one of our former speakers. It's actually a two-part question from Andrew Curtis. He says, "Hi, Jen. There seems to be a real inertia embodied in industry where we have tens of thousands of people trained in jobs and roles that are not necessarily in line with sustainable development goals. Is there good resource mapping of current jobs and roles to those that we expect to appear in the future economy, including how many of those future roles we expect there to be?"
Yeah, so to my knowledge, and I welcome if others know of this knowledge, this resource, but one of my two closing points was that we don't know enough. So we see a role for ourselves in the future, but we actually do not know enough about jobs, skills, the sector. It's a real focus coming out of the Just Transition Commission in the UK, in Scotland, and the Scotland Skills Development Scotland. I always get the acronym wrong. With the focus on kind of understanding regional benefits in terms of job distributions, and I think it's a real, I'm going to keep coming back to CCS, but actually I realise this is more broadly. But even understanding our deployment pathways. At the moment in the UK, we're looking at hubs and clusters rather than distributed development. So how does that affect the skills, the jobs available? And so, we don't have a handle on that currently, and it's becoming, it was one of the recommendations from the IEA GHG report that I mentioned on mapping CCS and SDGs. It's come out of the, what's the other report that was come out recently, which is basically recognising that we need to have a better handle of what these jobs are, and importantly, is there going to be a job surplus? What reskilling is required? Is there going to be a skills gap? We just don't know. So as I say, if people do know of those resources, then I'd be really grateful to if you could pass them on to me. But from what we've been putting some work together on this and working with some of the hubs and clusters, and we just don't have a very good handle. And I guess the important thing as well is that distribution will depend on the region, country, region, and the kind of transition pathways for that area as well.
Okay, thank you. No questions coming through from the chat, but Hardy mentioned he was itching to ask some questions, so pass over to Hardy for a moment.
Thank you very much, Sebastian. So generous. And some of the questions already were answered. You mentioned about diversity at the end, that diversifying the geosciences is not just the technical aspect, but also inclusiveness. And you mentioned something really interesting, that is a kind of a report for organizations, conferences, events, meetings, to report what the factor they have. How are they inclusive in their organization or their conferences? And so are you suggesting that we could perhaps propagate this or announce this more broadly into the community to, if we are hosting, for example, Interpol conference or EAGE conferences, SPE and other associations, after every conference, they report the diversity factor of their conference and see if they always invited people, or they looked around and see, oh, we have a lot more inclusive community that we think we often have. So
yeah, I think there's so, I'm so excited by how much has been going on in this space kind of recently, and yet there's still a long way to go. So there's reporting, there's also actually actively engineering it, so that I was surprised that some of my colleagues had never heard of the word manel before. So you don't have an all-male panel. So it's a phrase, you know, and I know people who are boycotting conferences if there is an all male panel. There's even I was shown a kind of a website where you can submit your photograph of an all male panel. There's a fantastic one for the UK North Sea not so long ago. It's kind of heartbreaking, you know. It's funny and sad at the same time. So we could think about how to engineer our conferences to make sure that they are accessible in terms of where they are held, when they are held, options for joining, and, you know, travel. So I guess, yeah, accessible travel options. There's those sorts of practical aspects, but there's also, you know, this AGU move to not having alcohol at the poster events, and these kind of codes of conduct and expectations around conferences. And there's no point having that stuff buried at the very, very bottom of the website. That needs to be first and foremost, you know, an agreement that when you go to these events, this is what's expected of you. And to be honest, like what we know as well from kind of institutional change, having rules is no good if they're not actually enforced, and you're not listened to when you go forward with, you know, reporting something. So I suppose you need to have all these platforms to make sure that there's a kind of a two-way process, that you're not just saying that you shouldn't be doing this or should be doing this. There's also ways to kind of to enforce that. So I do think there's options to set expectations very, very upfront about whether it's events or organisations. And there is some really inspiring stuff. So, you know, I mentioned TSG, but EGU have been tracking this for a very long time, and it's just seeing who are they representing, and are the voices that are in the conference themselves, does that represent the membership, and how can they diversify that membership? So I've been really interested to find there's actually not too much guidance even around best practice for appointing, say, PhD students. So for encouraging diversity in PhD students. There's stuff within universities, let's say, about writing job adverts to make sure that it's not exclusive in language and so on. But with PhD adverts and stuff like that, you know, that most organisations, they don't fit within that structure. And I think there's a bit more that could be done there as well about where do we advertise our PhDs, how do we advertise them, you know, the shortlisting process and so on. So there's a whole range across our sector. I mean, I was specifically talking there about, you know, higher education and research, but for conference and events, for sure, there's much opportunity to enhance the diversity at those events.
Do you agree? Also, we should also somehow be outspoken and just, you know, stand up. If we see we are in the committee and we are one of those males that sit always in the committee, we just say there is something wrong here. You know, it's just that we should not just stay silent until someone comes and do that. We should just, in the class, even actively educate our next generation to just stand up if you see something is not really right.
Yeah, active bystander. So calling people out in a gentle or not so gentle, depending on the situation, you know, sure, way, taking, you know, offline, saying actually you used quite problematic language there, perhaps you didn't realise, and I'm, you know, it takes confidence to do that, and I, you know, I can say that I certainly wouldn't have felt comfortable doing that earlier in my career. So I think it's also a plea for those who are you know, further on in their career to really try and take the take the torch there and try and, like, don't leave it to the young female to keep calling out that there's an all-male panel, you know. It's boring, you know. So yeah, there's a plea to everyone to be an active bystander.
Well, thanks very much. Thank you.
Yeah, just on that note, and I do have one quick question for myself, but I think that having that positive challenge is really really fantastic. I remember, and I know Phil Ringrose is on the call. I remember Phil and some other colleagues and I were in a very male-dominated conference that we organized a few years ago, and someone called us out and said, "No, how diverse is actually your speaker field?" And that really was Chris Jackson, and that really stuck with me. And Chris was also one of our speakers. I think that I remember when Hardy and I first set up this webinar series. So I saw us, and we both realized we were falling in the trap of just inviting the white males to Geo's talk, we at least we try to make an effort, and we're not always succeeding, but at least we try to make an effort. The one quick question I had, and it's probably a longer answer, perhaps, what is your view on fieldwork in the geoscience for the future? Because inclusivity, something that always attracts geoscientists is to go to these these outstanding destinations to do fieldwork, but that immediately can become exclusive because it's very expensive. You may have some hidden disabilities that make you difficult to travel. There were discussions in the past about Peel College London going to Oman, having field trips, which the LGBTQ plus community found difficult. What do the field trips of the future look like in geoscience, which is coming back to your mapping analogy at the beginning?
Yeah, it's a really interesting thing, and there's so much progress in recent years in really bringing this to the fore around the different ways in which fieldwork can be exclusive and workarounds. And I can only just 100% admire some of the people who've been leading that change, bringing things out into the open, having uncomfortable conversations. And part of this is actually about having uncomfortable conversations in a positive way. And so having uncomfortable conversations around, how accessible is how we do things right now? How could we change it? What are our rules? What are our values around the geoscience, and also what kind of geoscientists do you want to have for the future? So I think there's a challenge around kind of ensuring that kind of these skills development that some people think you can only develop in the field, others have a very different perspective, and I think there's some really good resources coming out, and yet I think there's been events held on this topic more recently as well. So I guess it's one of that play of just have a good look at yourself, and like, what are we offering? What can we easily make changes to now? What could we raise for discussion for the future? Because I think one of the, people can sometimes feel that making change is just, you have to change everything in one, all in one go, and perhaps that's appropriate for what you're doing, a course overhaul or something. But actually, there are very basic changes that we can make very easily and implement in a quite straightforward way to be able to just, reduce, lower those barriers. Just that bit more, and that's not solving things, but it's about that progression. And I think being able to kind of map that is, coming back to mapping again, but I think to be able to map that is a really important, and people in institutions will be held to account if they're not offering accessible field skills training or development. Thank
you very much, Jen. Our time is up. We've actually run a little bit over the time, but there are a lot of comments from our audience. Thanking you for inspirational, motivational talk. Amazing presentation. I think, let me echo. So there's a fantastic, really inspirational talk. Great occasion for Earth Day today. There are some questions still in the audience that we haven't covered, so apologies for this. Again, thank you, Jen, for great talk, for taking the time to speak today, for taking the time to answer all the questions so diligently, and challenging us as a community to simply do better and prepare, get future ready. And thank you to the audience for great questions. And last but not least, Hardy, over to you for some final
thank you very much.
The next
it was really a very energetic event today we had. So thanks a lot, Jen, for this. Also, thanks to all the friends who are here and posted also questions. I'd like to take the chance and announce our next week's speaker is Maya Roker. Maya is from University of Eindhoven, Technical University of Eindhoven in Netherlands. She's going to speak about a journey through length scales in subsurface reservoirs, from molecular interactions to Darcy scale flow behavior. So until next week, at the same time, 4 p.m. Central European, 3 p.m. British, 7 a.m. California, and I'm missing airport, by the way, announcements. So stay happy, healthy, and tuned in to the channel of Geoscience and Geoenergy, and have a nice weekend ahead as well. Thank you very much, Jen. It was a great pleasure for us.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.